So thank you so much for coming. My name is Peach, and I used to work here for a really long time, and now I work mostly in and around the secondary school classroom. So long time thinking about feminism, and first time trying to incorporate feminism into real life and teach other people about it. So I'm super excited to have read this book and to be here with you all to talk to Emma about it. So Emma Casey is a reader in Sociology at the University of York and author of the previous book, Women, Pleasure and the Gambling Experience, and author of this book, The Return of the Housewife. Can we just have a little... Thank you. Okay, so this is, I think, a very timely book, definitely something that we need. And I think Emma's just going to start off with reading a little bit right from the start. Yeah.
So, it is September 2022. And social media is awash with images and posts about the end of summer and the autumnal chill in the air. Pictures of beaches and sunsets are slowly being replaced with fireplaces, candles, blankets and pumpkin-themed decor. At the same time, social media influencers are turning their attention to preparing their homes, clothes and families for winter. The seasonal change is palpable, with scents, textures, food and home decor all shifting in line with the colder months to come. For the social media cleaning influencers, the cleanfluencers, each change in season is critical. It's not just the weather that matters, it is also a time to mark the seasonal changes through the visual representation of the home. There is a renewed focus on the repositioning of household objects, a shift in soft furnishings to include more faux fur, fleece and blankets. There are changes in food preparation, bringing out the slow cooker and making hot chocolate, back to school organisation and planning, even beginning to prepare for Christmas. And for the cleaning influencers, autumn marks a key time for notable changes in cleaning practices. So gone are the breezy floral scents of summer and lines of washing drying on the line outside, to be replaced with more earthy autumnal scents such as pumpkin and blackberry that will soon move on to more Christmassy scents of cinnamon and orange. And this seasonal change is a big moment for the cleaning influencer. It is a chance to persuade followers of the need to change, to try something new, to feather the nest of home in a way that exudes coziness, organisation, comfort, cleanliness, calm and order. And these moments of change, represented in the display, planning, organising and preparing of domestic spaces, are an opportunity to re-articulate the home and one's position in it. So at the same time, in autumn 2022, the UK's most popular and well-known social media cleaning celebrity, Mrs. Hinch, has embraced the end of summer and the beginning of autumn with the launch of a new range of Mrs. Hinch branded Procter & Gamble cleaning products. There is fairy washing up liquid, flash floor cleaner, surface spray, dishwasher tablets, laundry detergent, fabric conditioner and scent booster powder. All are conspicuously branded with the Mrs. Hinch logo and are scented with the new frosted eucalyptus fragrance. There is a dramatic online build-up to the launch on Instagram, with the Joy of Clean Instagram page posting hints to their followers that there is something big afoot. A big announcement is on its way. The build-up continues in the days before the launch with pictures of Mrs. Hinch sitting behind some bunches of eucalyptus sprigs. The Joy of Clean promises that something very exciting, like new level, never seen before kind of exciting, is on its way. We can't wait to tell you, we know you're going to love it. Then, 48 hours later, the big product launch alongside a hashtag especially created for the occasion. The hashtag is HinchElyptus, which shoppers can use to tag themselves buying the products that are, for now, exclusively available at the British discount shop Home Bargains. In a reveal story posted to her Instagram page and shared to her 4 million followers, Mrs. Hinch creates a dramatic launch of the new cleaning range. Shot to look like she's creating the film herself on her own phone, the camera moves through her immaculately clean and stylish kitchen towards the under-sink cupboard. The door is slowly opened to reveal a perfectly clean space decorated with more eucalyptus leaves, below which bottles, containers, boxes and bags of her new Procter & Gamble frosted eucalyptus cleaning products sit. In a combination of humour, yes, I do decorate my under-sink cupboard, excitement and gratitude, Mrs. Hinch directly addresses her followers, the people most likely to buy her products. In her launch post, she writes, "I can't believe the day is here," and "can't wait to see what you make of it," before directly thanking her followers with a thank you message surrounded by hearts. And almost instantly, the products appear in other social media accounts all over Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Videos are uploaded into stories of shoppers thrilled and excited at the new product. "I'm just so excited. I've waited so long for this. Honestly, it smells amazing." The products are shown laid out on kitchen worktops, in cupboards, in shopping trolleys, in shopping bags, and even in excited selfies of shoppers holding their coveted bottles of Mrs. Hinch frosted eucalyptus products. The next post on Mrs. Hinch's Instagram page shows a montage reel of seemingly endless Instagram posts of the new cleaning products. Played against the 2021 single Summer 91, Looking Back by Noizu, the lyric, "I just can't stop looking back until it's a memory," reminds us of the message behind influencer culture. It is presented as an intimate journey of discovery and joyful personal betterment, a reflection of how far you've come, but always remembering and humbly reflecting on your roots. She says, "Thank you. All of your tags, posts, stories, reels are incredible. I'm a bit speechless, if I'm honest." And narratives like this are, of course, key to the success of the advertisement. And cleaning in 2025 must be seen as absolutely more than simply cleaning. Selling cleaning products today is not just about buying the right product to do the job well. Rather, cleaning is entwined with popular notions of positive mindsets, personal fulfillment, excitement, and enhancing your self of self. A type of sentimental reflection of who you are.
Thank you so much for that. So as we all heard, so much in there, but I think that does at first at least show us the I think you're quite humorous in your tone and also very empathetic, which I have really enjoyed. What I want to ask first is how the landscape for cleanfluencers really has emerged, and you mentioned how the boom for that was the pandemic and the lockdowns. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I first became interested in the cleaning influencers or the cleanfluencers during the COVID-19 lockdown. So what we saw during this time was firstly a renewed focus on germs and hygiene, but also an increased focus on social media and especially Instagram. So Instagram really kind of exploded during the COVID-19 lockdown for obvious reasons. Really, people were indoors, their social lives, their leisure time, everything became on social media. You can see why it was a sort of useful platform for people to sort of communicate with other people and also to sort of show and share images of their homes. So I think it was partly that. I think it was the sort of intensification of Instagram, which sort of coincided with a kind of renewed focus on the home and the domestic space, which has kind of always been there to a certain extent, but it was really exacerbated during lockdown. So it was almost like a sort of coalescence of quite a few different things that happened at the same time. but Instagram played a really big role in it, and you know the particular features of Instagram make it you know ideally suited for the cleaning influencers. So you know the idea is that anybody can take part. All you need is a mobile phone in your hand, a smartphone, and access to the app, and anybody can you know take part in the life of clean influencing. Yeah.
Thank you. I think one thing that I was quite taken aback by was how at that point there could have been lots of avenues actually for people to come together, or for there to be like openings for a new or imagining of how we do receive a home when everyone is inside. And you mentioned like a quote from the Prime Minister at the time, thanking mothers for kind of taking on the role of being already mother, already possibly being employed, and now having to do that in the house too, but also now having to be teacher, and also having to do everything else. I feel like I've kind of lost where I'm going with that, but I feel like there's a really good sense of how this promotion of a housewife comes on the back of hard times historically.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
could you tell us?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I explore in the book is the fact that the sort of popular representation of the white woman housewife is absolutely nothing new. So if you look, you know, across history, there are all kinds of examples of the kind of you know the willing, happy female housewife, and it goes right back, in fact, to the sort of 17th century, which I talk about in the book. So in a lot of ways, the contemporary cleaning influencer is really nothing new. You know, she's a kind of reinvention of the same old story, really. But you're right, wherever you see sort of moments of political crisis, economic crisis, for example, or health crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic, you often see a resurgence of these kind of hyper-conservative representations of the housewife. So actually, that's not really anything new. That's quite has quite a long history. So if you think about like the 1950s housewife, for example, you know that coincided with you know a real sort of drive to persuade women to get back into the home. You know, after having worked during the Second World War, for example, in jobs that were you know traditionally seen as for men. So yeah, there is a kind of long history of this. But the quote from that you mentioned from the COVID-19 pandemic, this was it was Rishi Sunak actually, but it was before he was Prime Minister. It was when he was Home Secretary, and he released a poster, and the poster was like had sort of 4 cartoon images, and it was one of those COVID-19 stay-at-home images. Advertisements, and each image had a woman doing something around the home. So like image 1 was a woman mopping the floor, image 2 was a woman I don't know, like homeschooling her children, image 3 was a woman ironing, and the only man depicted in it was like in image 4, like lounging on the sofa. and then Rishi Sunak thanked mums in Parliament. Yeah, he said we need to thank mums everywhere. So that kind of the sort of, I'm not saying mums don't need to be thanked, but the sort of implication that it's women's responsibility to pick up the domestic load is centuries in the making, and it really sort of finds its logical conclusion in the sort of contemporary world of the cleaning influences.
I mean, I feel like there was just such an extension of a workload, and that expectation that the people who need to pick it up are women is something I think you quite expertly tease out throughout this book, which is fantastic. I wonder then, just going back to what you previously said, how does the use of Instagram and that digital landscape change that traditional view of the housewife, of the 1950s housewife, or the Thatcherite housewife, what happens?
Okay, well, yeah, so I suppose it's important to say something about the history. So at each stage of the popular representation of the housewife, she has a sort of slightly different manifestation. So the 1950s housewife is different to the 1980s housewife, for example. So Margaret Thatcher in the 80s often presented herself as a housewife. So she often conducted interviews in women's magazines, for example, which was very unusual. She's the only prime minister to have ever, or she was at the time the only prime minister to have been on Women's Hour, the Radio 4 programme. So she was often depicted in her apron in the kitchen of Downing Street cooking, and she used the language of practical housewifery all the time in her political narratives. And she, I think, is behind the sort of notion of the superwoman. So this idea that the ideal female citizen is one who cracks on with the job. You know, she's a brilliant paid worker, she's also a brilliant unpaid worker, she doesn't complain. Well, she might kind of, sometimes make a witty remark about the fact that she's doing everything, but generally she just kind of gets on and does it. And so the cleanfluencer is something slightly different to that. In fact, there's a big backlash at the moment to the superwoman, which I'm quite interested in. So a lot of the cleanfluencers say things like, just do what you can, just do what you can manage, just be you. But it's a kind of, the rhetoric is very sort of empty, because of course in a kind of, a late capitalist society, I can't say to my head of department, I'm not coming to the meeting today because I'm, prioritising my self-care, and I'm just being me and I'm putting my family first. It just doesn't work. So it all boils down to the fact that capitalism is completely dependent on the unpaid labour of women, and it always has been. And we've seen examples throughout history of when women have withdrawn their unpaid labour. So not just housework, but also caring for, unpaid caring work, for example. So you might have heard of the women's strike in Iceland in 1975. So this was a Women's Day of Strike Action, where 90% of women took part and participated. They withdrew their labour for 24 hours, and the country came to a standstill. It was unbelievable. So men had to take their children to school, to work with them. Beds were left unmade, dishes were left unwashed. The country ran out of sausages because they were like the fast food of the day, and they were sort of quick. So there's a kind of long history of, but this is the opposite, isn't it? This is about kind of maybe acknowledging how hard it is to try and do everything in a way that Margaret Thatcher wouldn't have approved of, but at the same time, not still ultimately getting on with it and finding. We might come on to this in a minute, but the way the way cleaning and housework is being sold today is that actually it's quite good for you, and it sparks joy, and it's beautiful.
Yes, fantastic. I think all of what you just said there really situates this book as the anti-capitalist book that it is, which is also quite fantastic. Yeah, it's definitely in there. It's definitely in there. I wasn't just looking for it; it popped out at me. But yeah, I think there's something so interesting about the way that domestic load and mental load and the way that cleanfluencers are using the language of difficulty and overcoming to still promote doing the domestic labour as a way to self-actualise and like be a better version of yourself in that very neoliberal, individualistic way.
Yeah.
So yeah, tell us how cleaning does or doesn't spark joy.
So you all know where this concept of sparking joy comes from, don't you? So this is Marie Kondo, who is a Japanese declutterer. She's a professional declutterer, very, very successful. So I think it was 2014, I think. She had a Netflix series. She has a range of books, very popular, and a very sort of ultra minimalist aesthetic. And her argument is that by decluttering and getting rid of all of your junk and making your homes as minimalist as possible, it's a form of sparking joy. This is something that can give us joy and happiness. And she's quite different from the cleanfluencers because she's not actually cleaning in any of her videos. So the cleanfluencers came slightly after Marie Kondo, but they have a very, very similar set of ideas behind what they're doing. And that idea rests on the notion that whatever problems you're suffering from in your life, whatever, the kind of, the consequences of the struggles and the inequalities that might burden your everyday life might be, the solution is a highly individual one. So in contemporary capitalist societies, we don't really have much of a language to or a vocabulary to challenge that. The vocabulary is always one which essentially suits the capitalist marketplace, which is that if you're suffering, if you're depressed, if you have terrible anxiety, if you're really struggling with the domestic load or whatever, the solution is a personal one. Yeah, so all you have to do is kind of change your mindset, follow your dreams, all of these kind of mantras, which are kind of not just systemic in influencing culture, but across influencer culture more generally. We see those kind of hashtags all the time, don't we? My life may be hard, I may have no money, I may be very anxious and depressed, but I am also blessed. So it's kind of, housework is presented as something which can give you joy, and actually something that's good for your mental health. And I have absolutely, in the process of writing this book, I have scoured my university library catalogue, I've scoured the British Library catalogue, and I am yet to find a single peer-reviewed piece of research which says that there's a positive correlation between cleaning your home and it having a positive impact on your mental health. So I think this is actually really quite dangerous. But everybody's buying into it. In the book I've got an example of the Samaritans, for example, sponsoring the cleaning brand Minky and inviting customers to design their own positive thinking Minky sponge. So it's very, it's completely embedded, but there's no scientific evidence to support it as far as I can see. But it's a very sort of clever marketing technique, isn't it? This is something that'll make you feel better, and of course it completely flies in the face of decades of, not just decades, centuries of feminist scholarship, which says the complete opposite. So Simone de Beauvoir talks about how housework is a flight from self. She says it's actually a form of sadomasochism. And there's a really long history of feminists actually saying the complete opposite. So it's really interesting to think about where this kind of, I would probably call it a myth, where it's come from. Why? I imagine it's a marketing technique. It's a very convenient one, isn't it?
I think thinking about those positive minkies. It reminds me of I think possibly the worst advice I was ever given by a mental health specialist, which was just to put post-it notes of nice mantras on my mirror, and I read them to myself every day. And I think you kind of touch on that aspect of CBT and thinking and that way of attempting to change your mindset. And it's not necessarily that might not work. It just needs to be a very small aspect of a much larger response.
I think it probably has a sort of temporal impact. So even going back to Simone de Beauvoir, even she talks about the temporary satisfaction to be gained from having a nice shining clean stove. But that's the point, it's very, very temporal, as housework often is. The moment you clear up, it's messy again. It's completely unrewarding in terms of labour. The opposite of something that would be good for your mental health, I think.
I would 100% agree with that. I think one thing that you mentioned similar to that is, and you just mentioned, and those the centuries of pushing back against housework, or demanding wages for housework, is these like seeds of resistance that are potentially there and in the witty remarks, or being wanting to borrow somebody else's husband because they help out, or like creating your own embroidered cloths. Could you tell us just a little bit about how that's maybe in there?
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing, isn't it? The cleanfluencers do often directly address the inequalities of housework. Sometimes they complain about it, but ultimately they're the ones who sweep up at the end of the day. So it's like there's a sort of at the beginning of the book I've got a section where I talk about lockdown memes. So there were loads of like lockdown memes used, and they were always like a sort of witty sort of remark on the fact that it was, that there was that kind of gender imbalance in terms of domestic labour at in the home. But it's kind of like, it's a sort of ironic recognition of what's happening, rather than and laughing about it, rather than actually kind of trying to do anything about it. So yeah, you get images of cleanfluencing culture is basically, as far as I can see, more or less 100% women, and predominantly white women as well, young white women. There are very, very few men that feature in any of the videos, and when they do, they're sort of presented as either helping out, or helping out, not doing the house, but just helping out. And people will say things like, like you say, can I borrow him? He seems really great. Or there's like a kind of a sort of, the other thing you see a lot of is people sort of laughing at what their partner or husband has done. So, haha, I might as well do it myself because look how badly it's been done. So it's a kind of maybe an unwitting kind of reproduction of the inequalities through these cleanfluencing videos. Yeah.
I think there's a really good quote from you that is kind of about like existing in a neoliberal world, and it's just that there's a separation of common experience from community, which intensifies isolation, and the way that existing in a digital culture can do that, and maybe prevent transformative action, or kind of being able to commune with people in a more meaningful way. But there's also a really interesting way that you talk about how cleanfluencers co-opt that language of things like transformative or life-changing, or just as if
Empowering.
Yeah. So I wanted to maybe talk a little bit, just check the time. I'm also going to come to ask some questions from you all in about 5 minutes. This is your warning. But yeah, if we can talk about that aspect of empowerment through cleaning, or that this is, a personal, individual choice.
Yeah, so the language of the cleanfluencers as well is, because it's social media, and this is actually a very new thing. We were talking about this before, weren't we? This is a sort of really kind of advanced form of confessional culture. So when we look at social media, especially cleanfluencing accounts, the sort of intimate detail that reflects people's everyday lives is pretty unprecedented, actually. We kind of take it for granted now that everybody's going to be professional, but it's actually quite a new thing, and it's really intensified on Instagram. So you get cleanfluencers, they don't just clean their homes, they sort of present as if they are actually your friends, and they never talk about followers or customers, which a lot of the people who are looking at the accounts are. They say, I love you guys, you're great friends, I found my Insta family here. So it's all incredibly personal. They'll I don't know how many of you are sort of familiar with the content, but they will do things like hold the mobile phone and talk directly into it, hold the phone themselves, and it kind of has a sort of feeling that you're kind of having a chat with a friend and that they're confiding in you, but they're not, because they've got like 4 million followers who are also looking at the same video. So it kind of has that sort of language of community, you know, my Insta community. And of course, that was in the 1970s, the women's liberation movement was all about combating some of these tropes and inequalities by forming alternative radical collectives. So it is quite interesting how that kind of language of collectivity is kind of being used again, but obviously in a very sort of warped neoliberal way, and in a way that ultimately is selling us stuff. But it's never presented as selling, and this is something quite new as well. So when you look at the sort of history of cleaning products and how they're marketed, it's always been in a way which sort of where the company selling the products is quite invisible. But here, the person selling the products is your friend, right? You know, I've got a secret to share with you. You know, I'm gonna. I don't normally do this, but I'm going to gift you this voucher. You know, all feels very personal, and it feels like a friend is kind of, you know, it feels almost quite altruistic. But it's, you know, it's kind of making a few people, you know, incredibly wealthy.
I think there's just something there that is so interesting, that we're at a stage where not only are women expected to take up this domestic load, and a mental load and all of those things, but now women are in charge of creating the perfect image of a housewife themselves, so that, you know, like the people who are being paid to advertise these products essentially don't have to do that work anymore. They're making loads of money. They're not even spending money anymore, really, having to do the advertising work, because you have all of these people doing digital labour. And apart from those few celebrity cleanfluencers, it's women doing it for free.
It's a brilliant business model, isn't it, really? Because, yeah, like you say, you've got unpaid followers, vast majority of whom are women. Yeah, every share, every like, every comment, you know, every time you click a link, you know, you're doing free marketing for, you know, big multinational corporations like Procter and Gamble. You know, it's a brilliant business model.
Yeah, it's so horrible.
Yeah.
I think before I come to you all, so again, just letting you know, think of a question, ask it. Another thing that is also quite new with the digital cleanfluencer is that working class women seem to be the image, and that's not necessarily how housewives were, or like the white woman housewife was previously presented or advertised as aspirational.
Yeah, well, she's the sort of ideal neoliberal citizen, isn't she? So she starts off working class, and through her cleaning and her positive thinking, she becomes this kind of ultra wealthy. So it's a similar sort of principle, but within a new type of kind of advanced capitalist neoliberal economic structure, basically. Yeah.
Wow. On that note, any questions? Perfect. Yes.
I wonder if you could say anything more about like weird layers of someone like Mrs. Hinch. Obviously, is making loads and loads of money out of this, but she's almost like she's become the breadwinner by cosplaying as not the breadwinner. Presumably, like I don't know, like her husband and like her family and stuff, and also building this wealth that's come from her. Like specifically being the ideal housewife and not someone who is out making money, but from that she's breaking it.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, you know, the ideal citizen, from the 80s onwards really, the ideal feminine citizen is somebody who not only performs her housewifery duties to perfection, but she's also entrepreneurial as well. So this goes from Thatcher onwards. So previous generations of women had other ways of doing this. So if you think about the Tupperware parties in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, for example, you know, that kind of bridged the gap between the domestic and the kind of public entrepreneurial image. So it was a very sort of respectable kind of way in which women could make money. And in a way, if you can make it work, cleanfluencing does make you the ideal citizen. You know, you're beautiful, you're kind, you've got an amazing house, you're always around for your kids. You know, you don't have to go to work, like physically to the office because your job is in the home. So yeah, it makes it look like managing the complexities of everyday life in capitalist society is doable, and therefore it makes a lot of people feeling like they're not measuring up and that they're failing. You know, the majority of people for whom this kind of scenario is never going to work.
Shame is such a powerful emotion as well, and it's
Yeah.
so capitalised on in this community, but also in just a neoliberal society. Yeah. Do we have any other questions just now? Do you have any online? Not just now. That's okay. I've got tons. So you can think of some more. I think kind of just I'm gonna piggyback off that breadwinner question because it was good. It was good. Where are the men? Where are they? I'm not gonna leave you with that. That's a joke question. But I think what is interesting is that there seems to be a lack of awareness, purposeful or just genuinely not knowing or remembering that being able to be a woman independent from a home or a husband is actually really recent in the UK.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how they I don't know where this question's going, how they managed to put forward that rhetoric that this is something actually very empowering and very much for you and is based in choice, as opposed to actually a very old idea that we're barely untangling from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean I think that's partly why I was so fascinated, because it does really seem to kind of fly in the face of decades of, you know, really powerful feminist activism, and which I think is impossible to ignore, actually. So if you think about something like Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique book, you know, she writes about, she writes really explicitly about the direct link between being a sort of middle class, stay at home suburban housewife and clinical depression.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is kind of, it's sort of not possible to ignore that, I think. But the way the cleanfluencers deal with it is by kind of being very, very confessional about their mental health. So quite often you see cleanfluencers like taking their antidepressants, you know, very publicly, or talking in really kind of personal detail about their feelings of anxiety and stress. But it's so interesting that the connection between that and the kind of, you know, inequalities isn't made. You know, the sort of constant suggestion is that if I just sort of, you know, clean my way out of this, or think my way out of this, then I'll be okay. So the kind of impact of those early feminist studies and activism does linger, I think, but it's kind of twisted so that it fits the marketplace. That's what's happening, I think. I think it's being pushed ultimately because it makes money. I can't think of anything. I know that sounds really cynical, but
No, I think we should be cynical in a capitalist world. I think we have to be. Hello, yes, please.
Yeah, it was just, I don't know if this is stretching it too far because it's not quite the housewife staying at home, but I wondered if you've seen, it's a bit more niche, but the kind of altruistic trend where people partner with their brands and then do cleans, sometimes for places that are going to be kind of declared a health hazard and people can't live there anymore. And there's almost like an attempt to kind of recapture community there because they're often free cleans, and it's also we have emphasised multiple times I'm not making anything from this, I'm not making anything from this. And then Scrub Daddy or their big one are kind of sponsoring it.
right.
And then there's also a lot of people kind of used to, as in what you're saying, kind of suggesting that more questions will go before they'll continue not to. And it often seems to have
shed of community, but there's a resistance to cleaning outside your home as well.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. What's that called? Altruistic?
Well, I just made that.
Oh, you just made that. Wow. Great job.
It comes across my timeline a lot, and I do watch them because they come across really heartwarming, but ultimately it's kind of still fitting into the same system, and it's brand promotion.
But it's sort of embedded in communities, is it?
No, it's just that the person I follow two people that do it, one in the UK and one I think in the US, and they reference other people that do it, and it's just that they talk about how people need helping hands, like they can't, even if they never clean this one again after I've done it, I've given them a chance to kind of have a cleaner space.
Yeah.
There's often a reference to structural problems like landlords not doing anything or the council, but it's still there's that private element. There's kind of also I'm not using this I'm living very constantly and barely making ends meet, and I'm getting sick from some of these cleans because it is like hazardous. Some of these, and it seems to still fit into.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. There's a lot of kind of spin-offs, aren't there? And I think anything in the last chapter, I talk about sort of green shoots and hopefully like radical alternatives as well. And yeah, I think the trick is to kind of to turn more to the community. So you know, Sheryl Sandberg talks about leaning in, and that's been such a powerful message. You know that the solutions to all of our problems are within, but actually it's in my mind not true at all. I think if we go back to the 70s or the early 80s, that notion that we can achieve greater equality through collectives of care, for example, which seems to be a little bit like what you're talking about there. That sounds, it sounds quite good. I mean, I finished the research for this in 2022, at the very end of 2023, and social media advances so rapidly. So yeah, no, it's really really interesting point. And actually, I think that's another important point, that Instagram is new, really, and also
Very new.
and the shift from it being a basic photo sharing app. So can you remember the old logo? It was like an old sort of
Like a
camera, so it was literally a photo sharing app, and then in 2016 they changed the logo and introduced the stories feature, which obviously expire after 24 hours, so it kind of hooks people in. And then in 2017 they launched the paid partnership link, and that completely transformed the way that people use Instagram. So it's very, very new. It's not. So yeah, the fact that it's kind of unfolding is really interesting, and the Cleanfluencers won't be here forever.
So we actually have a couple online as well. So can we just have one from online and then I'll come to you?
Okay. So actually, they're both about tradwives and quite closely related. So the first one is, I was wondering if you touch on tradwives in the book, or maybe if you could speak to that now. And the second one is asking, can you tell us a bit about the difference, if any, between tradwives and cleanfluencers? Because the tradwife movement feels like it almost embraces the image of kind of like wealthy entrepreneurs as opposed to working class, leaning more into kind of like embracing motherhood as well.
Yeah. So they're often, the tradwife and the cleanfluencer are often talked about interchangeably, but actually they're very, very different. So the tradwife kind of hails from the US. The tradwives tend to be sort of Christian, conservative. They have a sort of ranch living aesthetic, often big homes in places like Utah, and loads of children. Whereas cleanfluencer, very religious. Did I say that? Christian, conservative, very patriotic as well. Whereas and middle class. Whereas in the UK, the British cleanfluencer is quite often sort of upwardly mobile. So she quite often has this sort of meritocratic tale associated with her. So somebody like Mrs. Hinge, and also Stacey Solomon, who you might know as well, who's kind of become a bit just a cleanfluencer. They start off with very sort of humble origins. So Mrs. Hinge's dad was like a Durham miner, for example. I know so much about Mrs. Hinge. but her whole sort of rags to riches story is, really an important part of the narrative. And so I think that's the kind of main difference. And it kind of is partly because in the UK we have such a unique class system that is literally like nowhere else on earth. And so the British cleanfluencer key influencers kind of emerged within that sort of network. So there are definitely similarities in terms of entrepreneurialism and mass commercialization. So I do have a little section in here on the American trad wives, and they're just completely fascinating. So they'd be like, making, effortlessly, like a beautiful dress and an apron, like making their own mozzarella and honey and jam with like a baby like clamped to it, and loads of kids running around, and it looks so effortless and beautiful and languid and very rural. But then in the next shot, you'll see them somewhere like ultra commercial, like in Las Vegas, like being awarded the crown for Mrs. America 2000, whatever it was, like ballerina, like 6 weeks after giving birth in a swimsuit on stage. It's just like, it's impossible. So you get that kind of jarring sort of juxtaposition between the kind of homespun aesthetic with, like really aggressive kind of commercial capitalism as well.
Yeah, I think you do make that point quite well, I think, in the book, that they are distinct and they are separate. We did an event with Lewis sharing for Pinkfield a couple of weeks ago, and that kind of looks at how even the term trad wife is one that was created by like a right-wing conservative movement, which is interesting because it doesn't quite reflect on the class system that we have here, as you've said. So fascinating, so terrifying. Hello.
I don't really know how it works in terms of like your writing the book, but like, does Mrs. Hinch know?
Yeah.
It's like,
Well, she might do.
you have to like, because I kind of assumed that when you're writing about someone, that it has to kind of be checked by them. I don't know.
Yeah, you have to follow the ethical guidance on using kind of digital content. So if it was somebody who had like a private account, for example, then you wouldn't talk about them. But if it's somebody who is completely public and you're citing from their published books, so a lot of the references to Mrs. Hinch are in her kind of published books and things, then it's fine to because I think the interesting thing about all of this is that one of the reasons it's so difficult to critique influencer culture, and the clean influencers in particular, is because they are like real people, and it almost feels like a bit unkind, and and also kind of, in the book I talk about Sarah Ahmed's idea of being a feminist killjoy. So it almost feels like, why would you want to criticize something that's so beautiful and somebody who's achieved so much, and it's but I think the point I make is that I'm not criticizing anybody, any individual person or key influencer at all. The book is about the structures of patriarchy and capitalism and neoliberalism, which have created them. And if somebody goes online to create their own clean influencing account and makes money from it, then I absolutely wouldn't criticize them as such. But I think the phenomenon is just so fascinating and really kind of connects with the kind of moment that we're in terms of like politics and culture in 2025. Yeah, but it is a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in here about kind of empathizing with the desire to do this work, or the desire to make this work feel productive and important. That when you read it, because you can buy it, when you read it, I think a lot of that will be kind of like teased out, which is fantastic. I think just, does anyone else have any questions? Oh, perfect.
I know you were speaking about how you've not seen any research to kind of back up this as a positive impact on someone's like mindset and public opinion, but how would you do that from like say a control aspect? Because often when you see like cleaning influencers, like it doesn't necessarily represent how much someone can from an average perspective, but often it's up to quite an extreme. So have you found any research that would you personally think it comes from potentially like fulfilling a control aspect?
So you mean like compulsive? cleaning or something. Yeah.
Like it's like you say, like when you clean as soon as you're done, it will come nice again. But that's something that seems hard to control. And
Yeah.
much like bring them joy in a different way. So do you find anything to links to that?
Yeah, definitely. So there is a link, an established link between excessive cleaning and mental health. But I think the point I was making is that I can't find anything to say that cleaning is a solution. You know, cleaning has a sort of positive impact on your mental health. I can't see that kind of evidenced anywhere. But yeah, there's definitely a really well established link between something like obsessive compulsive disorder maybe and cleaning. But yeah, I can't find anything at all. If anybody's got anything, feel free to send it over.
Is it like I guess like a temporary dopamine hit that
Yeah. Yeah.
linking to
Yeah.
mental health, but it's obviously
Definitely, yeah, definitely, and there's definitely a temporal pleasure. And if somebody's saying that they get pleasure from having a clean and tidy house, I definitely wouldn't, tell them that they're not, deny them that. But the point about all of this as well is that everybody likes to come home to a clean and tidy house. It's lovely to come home and have a nice, Zaflora smelling house or whatever, and beautiful clean surfaces, and nice food cooking in the oven. But like, why is it that we're sort of inundated with these images of women creating all of that? Because it's not something that only women benefit from. Having a clean and tidy home is, well, it's to a certain degree essential for basic like hygiene and survival purposes. But it's nice for the whole family, not just for the person that's doing it. So I find that quite interesting as well.
I think there's like a thread there as well about how much of it is attainable, because in these videos, there's hardly any kind of memorabilia or like a stack of unopened letters from the bingo or like whatever. Like, they're not there, and the work isn't being done either. It's kind of like those razor adverts where they like shave an already shaven leg. Like they're cleaning something that's already quite clean.
They do, but there's also at the moment a bit of a trend for like showing the failure as well. So at the start of a reel, you might see like a really messy room with toys scattered all over the floor, or I don't know, they open a fridge door and it looks really disgusting inside. But the point is that the failure is always resolved. So there's a thing called tap to tidy where the influencer clicks their fingers and suddenly it's sparkling.
Mm-hmm.
So it's weird because it's not actually, what you're watching isn't actually housework in real time at all. It's like a sort of really accelerated, speeded up version of housework, which doesn't reflect the realities of housework at all.
No, and I think it reflects precisely what you were saying about the kind of person that you're seeing doing that work. That sped up version of housework isn't accessible to a lot of people. It relies on you being young and able-bodied and privileged and all of those things.
Not really formulated, this is like a question yet, but usually they think about how maybe in the past it would be a kind of status thing to be able to employ another woman to clean your house for you, whereas now there's this element of like performance, and maybe it does just like to kind of women doing all like girl boss and housewife like combo. I can do all my and I'm also doing all this, but like I wonder how that speaks to kind of weird class politics dynamics.
Yeah, I mean there's a sort of ongoing debate within feminism, I think, about whether or not it's anti-feminist to employ a cleaner and pay another woman to, a poor woman or a woman of colour to clean your home for a really crap wage. And I think there's definitely something in that. But again, the interesting thing about the debate is that whenever the debate around hiring a cleaner fires up, it's always a kind of real focus on women. And you mentioned Cleanergate, #Cleanergate, which was a sort of Twitter debate, one of those horrible Twitter debates during COVID. And it was because, again, Rishi Sunak, as Home Secretary, said that nobody was allowed into your home unless they were a nanny or a cleaner. which and that was obviously massively problematic. But again, that was a really a moment where this kind of discussion around inequalities could have been opened up. And actually, it wasn't at all. It was, the emphasis was on women who hire cleaners. And actually, if you have a family with lots of people living in the house, the cleaner's not just, the relationship is not just with the person cleaning the home and the woman, the adult woman that lives there. It's also kind of, for the benefit of the whole family. But men don't really seem to be involved in these debates at all, which is quite frustrating.
It seems like the debates tend to be around whether or not this is an expression of internalised misogyny, or whether anyone has any kind of choice, or it's their money, they can do how they please, as opposed to looking at societal structures and how this is specifically ordered to negatively impact the most worse off.
Yeah, I mean, and it also, the sort of assumption that housework is women's work trickles right down to very low paid cleaners who generally don't have contracts. The conditions are terrible. I've met people before who don't even know the name of the person who cleans their house. It's horrible. And so that kind of devaluing of housework comes from the fact that it's seen as, not even low value, but zero value women's work that should be done out of love, out of care, out of obligation for your family. And that's why it's so devalued and so badly paid, because it's supposed to be stuff that women do out of love. And I think that's probably the key, really. The minute you sort of decouple that kind of association between housework as an expression of care and love, then there might be sort of fewer inequalities.
I think we maybe have time for one teeny question, if anyone has got another one. That's okay. Do you have any last things that you wanted to say? Anything that you feel like needs to be said? Because the whole book needed to be said, but there's so many books that I can't look at them anymore. My notes, I mean.
I'm just interested to see what happens next, really, because it does seem like when you have a moment of crisis, like the pandemic, and also when you get a lurch to the political right, so throughout the 20th century, whenever you see fascist movements, for example, it's quite often accompanied with these like hyper-conservative images of women as housewives. I don't think the clean influencers will be here forever, but they'll be replaced with something else. So I'm just quite excited to see what that might be.
That was really sinister. But I think cynical, sinister, that's the way to go. That's how we've got to be looking at this stuff. We've got to kill joy, like Sarah Ahmed
says.
So you can buy the book. You can buy that through there, and Emma, if you'd be happy to, you can also sign books through there too. That's all good. Yeah. So I'm just gonna steal your mic and let you walk through so that you don't have to run through a crowd. Could you just show Emma where she's to go? Thank you. So thank you so much.